What were medieval peasants' diets like? Were they all malnourished, unhealthy, and just living on bread? When thinking of food in the Middle Ages, it often brings to mind the lavish feasts of the nobility and the uncivilized poor peasants. In this video, we will uncover the real story about what the medieval peasants' living conditions and diet was like, and in the end, we will look at their height and muscle mass. Medieval society. Life for a peasant during the Middle Ages was not always as primitive and crude as often depicted. But life at the time was governed by the feudal system. The feudal system was a social and economic structure that dominated medieval Europe, particularly from the 9th to the 15th century. It was based on a hierarchy of lords and vassals, where land ownership and obligations defined the relationships between people. The king was at the top of the feudal hierarchy. He owned all the land in the kingdom. He granted large portions of this land to loyal nobles and bishops in return for their support, both militarily and politically. Beneath the lords were vassals, who in turn pledged loyalty and military service to their lords in exchange for a fief or parcel of land. Knights, often lower-ranked vassals, provided crucial military support and received smaller estates to support their duties and lifestyle. And at the lowest rung of society were the peasants or serfs, making up the majority of the population, including both free peasants and serfs. The peasants' role in society. Serfs were tied to the land they worked on. Unlike slaves, serfs could not be bought or sold individually, but they could not leave the land without the lord's permission. Their status was hereditary. The serfs had numerous obligations to their lord. They had to work the lord's lands and perform other duties like maintenance and repair. They also paid taxes in the form of crops, labor, or coins. In return, they were allowed to live on the land, receiving protection from the lord during conflicts or invasions. Despite their low status, serfs had some rights under feudal law. They were entitled to protection, justice, and the right to sustain themselves using common resources such as forests and rivers, though these rights were limited and controlled by the lord. Living conditions. Peasant life was tough but community-oriented. Villages had a common area and often a church, which was a central place for meetings and religious ceremonies. Their days were largely consumed by agricultural work on both their lord's land and their own small plots. This work followed the agricultural cycle, with plowing, sowing, and harvesting dominating their yearly activities. Aside from farming, serfs might also engage in other labor, like blacksmithing, pottery making, or carpentry, depending on the skills they possessed or the needs of the manor. Their homes were simple, typically constructed from wattle and daub with thatched roofs, often consisting of just a single room shared with family and occasionally livestock. Serfs typically owed 1/10 of their earnings to the church in the form of tithes and were expected to participate in religious observances and festivals. The church upheld and reinforced the social order, teaching that the feudal hierarchy was divinely sanctioned. Forests in medieval Europe were often owned by nobility and were subject to strict laws that preserved hunting rights for the elite. These forest laws banned peasants from hunting game within these areas. For peasants, the forest was a source of wood and other resources under certain conditions, but hunting large game was generally prohibited. This ensured that deer, boar, and other game remained plentiful for the recreational hunts of the nobility. Peasant families typically kept various animals, which were crucial to their subsistence. Chickens provided eggs, while pigs and cows offered meat and milk. These animals were integral to the peasant economy, providing food and labor, in the case of oxen and horses. Wages. It is challenging to estimate wages from the medieval period as it spans a long duration and economic conditions varied significantly over time and region, and people were not always paid in cash, but in goods. The most common monetary system in the Middle Ages was the system of pounds, shillings, and pence, which was known by various names in different languages. A laborer could expect to earn 2 pence per day. Reaping would pay 2 pence, while haymaking would pay 1 pence. Barrel makers or coopers would make 3 pence a day. Carpenters had a wage limit of 4 pence a day, and masons 5 pence. In comparison, a knight received 48 pence a day, and at the lower end, a baron's income was typically 300 times greater than that of a common laborer. In the 14th century, 1 to 1.5 pence bought you a gallon of ale. In the 12th century, you could buy 2 pounds of cheese for 1 pence, and in the 14th century, you could buy 2 dozen eggs for 1 pence. Overall, the life of a serf was one of subsistence, bound by the obligations of feudal loyalty and church tithes, yet also marked by a strong sense of community and faith. Staple foods. The cornerstone of the peasant diet was bread made from the flour of various grains. Depending on the region and what was available, this could be rye, barley, oats, or wheat. Wheat was the preferred grain because it makes lighter, more palatable bread, but it was more expensive and less common. Without personal ovens, most people relied on communal ovens to bake their bread, which was predominantly coarse and made from whole grains since producing white flour was more labor-intensive and wasteful. Another cornerstone of the medieval peasant's diet was pottage or porridge, and maybe what most people associate when they think of the diet of a medieval peasant. This dish was made by boiling grains until soft and mushy. Sometimes it also included herbs, spices, vegetables, legumes, and occasionally meat or fish to improve both taste and nutritional value. Vegetables such as cabbages, chard, onions, garlic, and carrots were also staples, eaten as side dishes if not added to pottage. Pigs were a favored choice among livestock as they could forage for their own food and would eat leftovers humans don't eat. Chickens were another favorite as they also could forage for their own food and required minimal maintenance, providing a valuable source of protein through their meat and eggs. Their small size also made them easier to sustain through winters. Milk, cheese, and butter were common in areas where cattle were kept. Fish played a crucial role in the diet, particularly due to Christian restrictions on eating meat on certain days and during Lent. Fishing rights were subject to the Lord's permission, though peasants living by the sea could fish freely. Fish such as mackerel, eels, cod, and preserved forms like salted fish and pickled herring were staples, with roasted eel regarded as a delicacy. Beans and peas rich in protein were staples in the peasant diet. Easily stored in their dried form, they were used throughout the year, providing an essential source of nutrients, particularly during the winter months. Supplemental foods. The diet was supplemented by a variety of other sources when available. Fruits were commonly consumed raw or cooked, often featured in desserts or used to make beverages such as wine and cider. Wild mushrooms and berries like raspberries, strawberries, and blueberries were foraged, and nuts such as hazelnuts, walnuts, and chestnuts were collected. Depending on the season and region, peasants collected foraged greens like nettles, dandelions, and other wild plants, incorporating them into their meals for added nutrition. Honey was the predominant sweetener, with beekeeping an important practice for producing honey and beeswax for candles. In regions like Scandinavia, England, and parts of Eastern Europe, honey was also used to brew mead for special occasions. Some peasants kept geese even though they were more expensive to buy than chickens. They were valued not only for their meat, but also for their fat, down for pillows and feathers for arrows. In coastal areas, seafood like lobster, crab, crayfish, clams, oysters, mussels, squid, eel, and even seals were part of the diet. They also ate more exotic meats like beaver, considered fish due to its fish-like tail, and a variety of birds and their eggs, including swans, sparrows, herons, and cranes, were sometimes consumed. Although often reserved for the elite, many of these finer meats occasionally found their way to peasant tables, illustrating that their diet was not exclusively pottage. Even though not everyone had the means to be able to maintain livestock, excavations and other clues show that meat was able to be bought for reasonable prices, supplementing what they could not grow or raise themselves with items purchased or bartered from street vendors, markets, or wandering fishmongers. In towns, prepared meals could be bought from cooks like pie makers and roasters. While the medieval diet was primarily based on what could be grown, raised, or foraged locally, it was supplemented by a range of other foods, demonstrating a diet that was more varied than often assumed. But as their diets were largely limited to what was available locally and seasonally, it often became much simpler during the winter months without much variety. Seasonal variations. To cope with seasonal changes and ensure food availability throughout the year, medieval peasants employed various preservation techniques. They smoked, dried, pickled in vinegar, candied, or packed food in gelatin or fat. During winter, Meat could also be preserved by freezing. Due to a lack of resources to produce sufficient fodder for their livestock during winter, peasants typically butchered much of their livestock in late fall. Only a few animals were spared, kept mainly for breeding purposes. This strategy was crucial for managing food resources and ensuring survival through the harsher months. In addition to meat preservation, medieval peasants dried various fruits such as pears, apples, peaches, cherries, and prunes, which helped sustain them during the long, fruitless winters. Herbs were a year-round staple in peasant diets thanks to drying techniques. Common herbs like parsley, sage, and rosemary were grown in kitchen gardens and used extensively to season and improve the palatability of dishes, as foods preserved by salting or drying often lost much of their taste when rehydrated and cooked, so herbs and spices were essential for enhancing flavor. Beverages. In the Middle Ages, ale and beer were the beverages of choice, due largely to the challenges of securing clean drinking water. The brewing process involved boiling, which helped eliminate harmful bacteria, making these drinks safer than water. These beverages were typically less alcoholic than modern versions, but were crucial for providing both hydration and calories. Historical records indicate that there were regulations specifying the daily rations of beer for certain types of workers, underscoring its importance in daily life and labor. In regions favorable to growing grapes such as France, Spain, and Italy, wine was common. While milk from cows, sheep, and goats was consumed, it posed challenges as it spoiled quickly without refrigeration and carried risks of transmitting diseases like tuberculosis. To mitigate these risks and extend the shelf life of dairy, milk was often processed into butter and cheese. These dairy products were safer, more durable, and formed an essential part of the medieval diet. Access to clean water varied greatly. In regions where uncontaminated water sources were available, water was commonly consumed, but maintaining the purity of these sources was challenging. Medieval communities had regulations aimed at protecting water quality, but the technology of the time limited them to relatively shallow wells. These wells were easily contaminated, especially in densely populated areas where they might be situated too close to cesspits. Eating habits and religious practices. Christianity exerted a significant influence on dietary habits during the Middle Ages, dictating not only what people could eat, but also when they could eat it. Adherence to the Church's dietary rules was viewed as a way to ensure one's place in heaven, reflecting the deep relationship between daily life and religious beliefs. One of the most prominent and rigorous of these periods was Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter. During Lent, Christians were expected to practice fasting and abstain from certain luxuries as a form of penitence. The Church mandated that during Lent, as well as on other specific days such as Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, the consumption of meat from four-legged animals and fowl was prohibited. This restriction also extended to products derived from these animals, such as eggs, cheese, and milk. The Church also designated specific feast days and periods of abstinence throughout the year to commemorate various events in the life of Christ and the saints, further integrating these dietary restrictions into the fabric of medieval Christian life. Dietary comparison. The medieval peasant diet, though limited in variety compared to modern diets, was robust in some ways and healthier in terms of being largely composed of whole foods and lower intake of sugar and processed food. But the medieval diet would likely have lacked some of the diversity and nutritional balance provided by modern diets. Height. The average height of medieval men in Northern Europe was approximately 5'8" or 173 centimeters, a figure that compares with some modern averages in some regions. This suggests that during periods of relative prosperity and stability, average heights were not that much shorter than today's heights in certain regions. Some individuals within the medieval populations achieved heights comparable to the taller segments of modern populations and were on average taller than people living in the 1600s and 1700s. During specific times, particularly during the medieval warm period, when agricultural conditions were favorable, there was a noticeable increase in average heights. This period had a warmer climate and better crop yields, supporting healthier and taller populations. But there were significant regional differences. For example, in regions like Scandinavia, average heights were generally at the upper end of the medieval range, living in less crowded environments, which helped reduce the spread of diseases and allowed better nutrition. On the other hand, in southern Europe with higher population densities, the average heights were often at the lower end of the spectrum. While there were individuals who reached modern-day heights, the overall conditions of the time often led to shorter average heights compared to today. Muscle mass. The muscle mass of medieval peasants can primarily be understood from the archaeological examination of skeletal remains. These remains provide insights into the muscular attachments and the overall robustness of bones that correlate with muscle development. Studies analyzing medieval skeletal remains often point to significant development in muscle attachment sites. This is particularly evident in the bones of the lower body, such as femurs and tibias, which show markers of strong muscular attachments suggesting regular strenuous physical activity. The robustness of leg bones in peasant populations indicates a lifestyle requiring extensive labor, which in turn would support greater muscle mass, particularly in the lower body. Upper body strength, while not as consistently documented as lower body strength, also shows considerable development in individuals who performed specific manual tasks. For instance, the humerus bones of medieval peasants often exhibit pronounced muscular markings, characteristic of demanding work, typical in agricultural tasks such as plowing, lifting, and carrying heavy loads. In comparison to modern standards, where physical activity levels are generally lower, medieval peasants would likely have had higher base levels of muscle mass than the average sedentary human today, particularly in muscle groups engaged in their daily tasks. Medieval diets were often calorie sufficient, but they were typically low in protein by modern standards, which could limit muscle growth and recovery. The typical peasant diet provided the necessary energy for daily tasks, but was not optimized for muscular development as understood today. Thank you for tuning into this episode. I hope you liked it. If you like our content, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share your thoughts on topics you are interested in for future videos. Thanks for watching.